The morning my stepson's file landed on my desk, the room went completely silent. Not because anyone recognized his name, but because I did. Commander Ethan Collins, United States Navy, my husband's son. The same man who had spent 3 years telling people I married his father for money. The same man who once raised a champagne glass at a family gathering and joked that some women marry for love, while others marry for beachfront property. The same man who had never bothered to ask what I did for a living. Now his personnel file sat less than 3 ft from my right hand. Inside were allegations serious enough to trigger a formal review. Around the conference table, nobody knew the connection. Nobody knew the officer under review was family. Nobody knew that for years I'd listened to his insults and smiled. And nobody knew the hardest battle of my career wasn't happening overseas. It was happening inside my own chest, because I wasn't just his stepmother. I was the Navy Inspector General. And the rules that had guided my entire career demanded one thing: absolute fairness. No favoritism, no revenge, no exceptions, not even for family. I stared at the file, then I opened it. And for the first time in my life, I honestly didn't know whether my heart or my training would win. Part 1. The gold digger in my own home. People often assume power changes you. In my experience, power reveals you. The older I get, the more I believe that. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 58 years old. For 35 years, I served in the United States Navy. Most people who met me in civilian clothes never guessed that. I preferred it that way. After decades of uniform ceremonies, deployments, inspections, and responsibility, I discovered that anonymity was one of life's greatest luxuries. 3 years before Ethan's file landed on my desk, I married Richard Collins. Richard was 62 then, a successful businessman from Virginia Beach. He owned a construction company that specialized in government contracts and commercial development. He was also a widower. His wife Susan had passed away after a difficult battle with cancer. By the time I met Richard, we were both old enough to know exactly what mattered. Neither of us was looking for excitement. We were looking for peace. The relationship developed slowly. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became dinner. Dinner became companionship, and companionship eventually became love. There was nothing dramatic about it. Just two people who had lived enough life to recognize something genuine when they found it. Richard proposed on a quiet evening overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. No audience, no photographers, no grand gesture, just honesty. That's probably why I said yes. The only complication was his son, Ethan. At the time, Ethan was 28 years old. Tall, confident, handsome, the kind of young officer people naturally followed. He'd graduated from the Naval Academy and was already building an impressive career. Richard adored him. And honestly, from everything I'd heard, I expected to like him too. I was wrong. The first time Ethan met me, I noticed it immediately. The smile that didn't reach his eyes. The handshake that felt more like an obligation. The questions that sounded polite but weren't. "What exactly do you do, Margaret?" I smiled. "I work for the Navy." His eyebrows lifted. "Doing what?" "Administrative oversight." Not technically a lie, not remotely the whole truth either. He nodded. Then he glanced toward his father. Something shifted in his expression. I didn't understand it then, I would later. The wedding itself was small, family and close friends, nothing extravagant. Richard wanted simplicity, so did I. Yet even before the honeymoon ended, the whispers had started. Not from strangers, from Ethan. At first it came through relatives. An aunt mentioning something awkward. A cousin changing the subject too quickly. A family friend looking embarrassed. Eventually I learned the truth. Ethan believed I had married his father for money. The accusation surprised me, not because it hurt, because it was so absurd. My military pension alone was larger than many Americans' annual salaries. I owned my own home. My investments were stable. I had spent decades earning every dollar I possessed. Yet somehow in Ethan's mind I was a gold digger. Richard wanted to confront him. Many times I wouldn't let him. "He's grieving," I told Richard. "Margaret, it's been years. People carry grief differently." Richard sighed. "You give him too much grace." Maybe I did. Or maybe I remembered being younger. I remembered how easy it was to judge situations you didn't understand. For a while I hoped Ethan would come around. Instead, things got worse. Family barbecues became uncomfortable. Holiday dinners became exercises in patience. Every gathering included some new comment, some new jab, some new insult disguised as humor. One Thanksgiving, he asked whether retirement was treating me well. I told him I wasn't retired. He laughed. "Must be nice not needing to work." Several relatives looked down at their plates. I simply smiled. Another time he joked about prenuptial agreements. Nobody laughed, especially Richard. Yet Ethan never seemed to notice or care. The strange thing was that I genuinely admired him. He worked hard, served his country, loved his father. Beneath the arrogance, there was a decent man struggling with something he couldn't name. I could see it even when he couldn't. The real turning point came during Richard's 65th birthday party. We hosted it at a waterfront restaurant in Norfolk. About 40 guests attended. Friends, family, business associates, retired military officers. It was a lovely evening until Ethan started drinking too much. At first, nobody noticed. Then his jokes became louder, sharper, less careful. I was speaking with one of Richard's friends when Ethan stood and tapped a spoon against his glass. The room quieted. He began a toast. At first it sounded normal, a tribute to his father, memories from childhood, stories from Navy football games. People laughed, then his eyes found me and everything changed. Some women marry for love, he said. A few people smiled politely, others marry for beachfront property. Silence, absolute silence. I remember hearing a fork hit a plate somewhere across the room. Richard's face turned red instantly. Several guests looked horrified. Ethan seemed pleased with himself as though he'd finally said what everyone else was thinking, but they weren't. Only he was. I raised my glass, took a sip and smiled. Nothing more, no argument, no lecture, no defense. The moment passed. The party eventually continued, but something inside me changed. Not anger, not resentment, acceptance. For the first time, I realized Ethan wasn't interested in learning who I was. He preferred the story he'd invented, and no amount of explanation could compete with a belief someone desperately wanted to keep. The next morning I packed my suitcase. Richard drove me to the airport. Neither of us mentioned the toast, not at first. Finally he sighed, "I'm sorry, you didn't say it, he shouldn't have." I looked out the window, "He'll figure it out someday." Richard shook his head. "You still believe that?" "Yes," he laughed softly. "You're a better person than I am." Maybe, or maybe 35 years in uniform had taught me something important. People often become their own punishment eventually. You don't have to help. My flight left Norfolk shortly after noon. By evening I was back in Washington. Back to classified briefings, investigations, oversight reviews, the responsibilities of the Navy Inspector General. Back to the life Ethan knew absolutely nothing about. As my government vehicle pulled away from the airport, I looked at the city lights and thought about family, about assumptions, about pride. I had no idea that within months those worlds would collide, and when they did, neither Ethan nor I would ever be the same again. When people hear stories like this, they often assume I disliked Ethan from the beginning. That would make the story simpler, but it wouldn't be true. The truth is, despite everything, I wanted him to succeed. In many ways, Ethan reminded me of officers I'd mentored throughout my career, ambitious, intelligent, competitive, confident enough to lead. Maybe a little too confident, but that wasn't unusual. The Navy has always attracted strong personalities. You don't command ships, aircraft, and sailors around the world by being timid. Confidence is necessary. The danger comes when confidence slowly turns into entitlement, and entitlement is harder to recognize than most people realize, especially when success keeps arriving. About 6 months after Richard's birthday party, I found myself attending a Navy leadership conference in Arlington. It was one of those events that filled large hotel ballrooms with officers, civilian officials, and military contractors. The kind of gathering where everyone spent half the day discussing leadership and the other half drinking coffee. I was reviewing briefing materials when I heard a familiar voice across the room. "Ethan." I looked up. He was standing with several officers, confident, relaxed, engaged in conversation. He looked every bit the successful commander. For a moment I simply watched, not as a stepmother, as a senior officer, and honestly I was impressed. His reputation was strong. His performance evaluations were excellent. His commanding officers consistently praised him. People spoke highly of his operational skills. Several believed he had admiral potential. That isn't praise given lightly in the Navy. The competition is fierce. Most officers never come close. Ethan was. As I listened from a distance, I felt something unexpected: pride. Not because he was family, because he had earned genuine professional respect. A few minutes later he noticed me. His expression immediately changed. Not hostile, just uncomfortable, the same reaction he always had around me. He walked over. "Margaret, Ethan didn't know you'd be here." I smiled. "I work for the Navy, remember?" He chuckled politely. The joke sailed right over his head. We exchanged a few harmless comments. Then he returned to his colleagues. Nothing remarkable happened, but as I watched him walk away, I remember thinking something strange. If he ever stopped judging people so quickly, he'd be unstoppable. At home, however, nothing changed. Ethan still treated me like an outsider. Richard noticed it constantly. One evening, we were sitting on the back porch watching the sun disappear over the water. The conversation drifted toward family, as it often did. "He still thinks you're after my money," Richard said. I sipped my tea. "Probably. I don't understand it. Maybe he needs someone to blame." Richard frowned. "For what?" I looked toward the bay. "For losing his mother." The answer seemed obvious to me, less obvious to Richard. Many people think grief disappears after a funeral. It doesn't. It simply changes shape. Sometimes it becomes sadness, sometimes guilt, sometimes anger, and sometimes it attaches itself to the nearest available target. In Ethan's case, that target happened to be me. Sad. Over the next year, Ethan's career continued rising. He received increasingly important assignments, more responsibility, more visibility, more opportunities. His father couldn't stop talking about it. Every family dinner included an update. "Ethan's leading a major project. Ethan's being considered for a new command. Ethan's supervisor says he's one of the best officers in his group. I listened patiently and truthfully I was happy for him. No matter how he treated me, I never wished him failure. That's something people often misunderstand about revenge. Real revenge isn't always wanting someone to lose. Sometimes it's simply refusing to become the person they think you are. On around that same time, small concerns began appearing inside Navy oversight channels. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just minor complaints. Most organizations receive them. The military is no different. A subordinate felt ignored, a leadership decision seemed questionable, an expense report required clarification. Ordinarily, such issues are resolved quickly. Most never become formal investigations. That was true of the first complaint involving Ethan. In fact, I never even saw it. The matter was reviewed at a lower level. No action required. Case closed, at least officially. Then another concern appeared. A few months later, another, still minor, still inconclusive, still nowhere near serious enough to threaten a career. Yet something about the pattern bothered several reviewers. Not the allegations themselves, the consistency. Different people, different locations, similar observations, a commander who occasionally blurred professional boundaries, a leader who expected special treatment, an officer who didn't always accept criticism gracefully. Again, nothing criminal, nothing outrageous, just enough to make experienced investigators pay attention. The one afternoon, I was reviewing routine oversight summaries when a colleague stopped by my office, Captain Rebecca Torres, one of the smartest officers I'd ever worked with. She handed me a folder, interesting trend developing. I glanced at the paperwork. What am I looking at? A cluster of leadership complaints. Common, not particularly. I skimmed several pages. The names meant nothing to me. The incidents appeared unrelated, at least initially. What's your concern? I asked. Rebecca leaned against the desk. Nothing specific. That's not an answer, she smiled. It's a professional instinct. I laughed. After 35 years in uniform, I understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes experience notices patterns before evidence does. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, then both of us moved on to other matters. Neither of us realized how important that folder would eventually become. Meanwhile, Ethan continued thriving. Promotion seemed inevitable. Senior officers trusted him. Junior officers respected him. His future looked secure. At one family gathering, Richard proudly announced that Ethan was being considered for a prestigious leadership position. Everyone applauded. Everyone except Ethan. He simply nodded as though success was expected, not earned. That reaction bothered me more than the announcement itself. Humility matters, especially in leadership. The moment you believe advancement is guaranteed, you've already begun making mistakes. I knew that. Unfortunately, Ethan didn't, not yet. About 4 months later, I arrived at my office on an ordinary Monday morning. The kind of morning nobody remembers until something changes everything. Washington was cold. Gray clouds covered the city. I grabbed coffee from the same cafe I'd visited for years, reviewed my schedule, entered my office. Nothing unusual, until I noticed a thick file sitting in the center of my desk. Large, formal, marked for senior review. That alone wasn't uncommon. What caught my attention was the name. At first, I thought I had read it incorrectly, so I looked again, then a third time. My stomach tightened instantly. Not from anger, not from satisfaction, shock, pure shock. Because printed clearly across the front cover were 3 words I knew better than most. Commander Ethan Collins, my stepson. For several seconds, I simply stared. The office suddenly felt very quiet. The city noise outside disappeared. Even the coffee in my hand seemed forgotten. I opened the file, and as I began reading the first summary page, I realized this was no longer a family problem. This was now a Navy problem, and that distinction would change everything. For most of my career, I believed the hardest part of leadership was making decisions. I was wrong. The hardest part is making decisions when your heart desperately wants a different answer. I sat alone in my office staring at Ethan's file. Commander Ethan Collins, my stepson, the young man who had spent years assuming I was after his father's money. The same young man whose career was now connected to a formal review process. I closed the file, then opened it again. Not because I doubted what I was reading, because I needed to remind myself of something. The Navy doesn't care about family relationships. The regulations don't care about feelings. The rules exist for everyone, period, including people we love, including people who hurt us, especially people who hurt us. Within an hour, I contacted legal counsel. That was the first step. Not because I had done anything wrong, because transparency matters. The moment personal connections exist, they must be disclosed. I informed the appropriate officials that Commander Ethan Collins was my stepson. Everything was documented. Everything was recorded. Everything was reviewed. The lawyers determined that I could remain involved in the preliminary oversight process because multiple independent layers existed between me and any final personnel decisions. Still, they emphasized one thing: absolute objectivity, no special treatment, no retaliation, no favoritism. Exactly what I would have demanded from anyone else. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes, looking out my office window, thinking about Richard, thinking about Ethan, thinking about the awkward family dinners that suddenly felt very far away. This wasn't personal anymore, it couldn't be. The initial allegations appeared relatively minor. Leadership concerns, questions about judgment, potential misuse of authority. Nothing criminal, nothing sensational, but enough to justify a closer examination. I spent the next several days reviewing reports, interview summaries, personnel evaluations, travel records, command climate surveys. Thousands of pages. Most people imagine investigations as dramatic confrontations. The reality is far less exciting. Mostly it's paperwork. Endless paperwork, tiny details, small inconsistencies, patterns that only become visible after weeks of examination. The first thing I noticed was that Ethan's strengths were real. There was no question about that. His performance evaluations consistently praised his intelligence. His mission results were impressive. His supervisors respected his abilities. Even some of the people who had filed complaints acknowledged that he was highly competent. That mattered. A fair investigation examines both strengths and weaknesses, not just the evidence that supports a conclusion. The second thing I noticed was more troubling. Several complaints described similar behavior. Different locations, different personnel, different years, yet the same pattern. Ethan often believed his judgment was superior to everyone else's. He resisted criticism. He occasionally pushed boundaries. He expected exceptions. Not constantly, not dramatically, but often enough that people remembered. The pattern wasn't criminal, it was cultural. And cultural problems have a way of becoming larger problems. One afternoon, Captain Rebecca Torres entered my office carrying another stack of documents. She closed the door behind her. Never a good sign. I pointed at the folder. More, she nodded. More, I leaned back. What are we looking at? Rebecca sat down. A deeper review of travel authorizations. I scanned the summary. Several entries had been flagged, nothing major. A hotel upgrade here, an unusual approval there, a reimbursement question somewhere else. Individually, each issue seemed harmless. Collectively, they painted a picture. A commander becoming increasingly comfortable with bending rules. Not breaking them, bending them, and that's often how trouble begins. People rarely wake up one morning and decide to become unethical. They take shortcuts, small ones, then slightly larger ones. Eventually, they stop noticing the difference. Rebecca watched me read. Finally, she asked the question I knew was coming. How are you holding up? I smiled faintly. Professionally or personally? Both. I considered the answer. Professionally fine. And personally, I looked down at the folder. That's more complicated. Rebecca nodded. No explanation required. She had served long enough to understand. Sometimes the hardest cases aren't the worst ones, they're the closest ones. Meanwhile, Ethan had no idea any of this was happening. At least not yet. The review remained confidential as required. Life continued normally, or at least it appeared to. Richard occasionally mentioned him during phone calls. Ethan got another commendation. Or Ethan's traveling again. Or his command inspection went well. Each update felt strange now. I possessed information neither of them knew. Information that could affect the future. Yet regulations prevented me from discussing any of it. The burden of confidentiality is rarely discussed, but it weighs heavily, especially when family is involved. A few weeks later, I attended a leadership conference in Norfolk. By coincidence, Ethan was there too. The event included officers from multiple commands. Hundreds of people, panels, presentations, networking receptions, the usual military routine. I saw him across a crowded ballroom, laughing with colleagues, confident as ever, successful as ever. For a moment I simply watched, trying to reconcile the image before me with the reports on my desk. That was the difficult part. People are rarely all good or all bad. The public version and the private version often coexist. The respected officer, the flawed leader, the proud son, the arrogant man, all of them were Ethan. At one point he approached me near a refreshment table. Margaret, Ethan, you enjoying the conference? About as much as anyone enjoys conferences, he laughed. The conversation remained brief, polite, surface level, the same as always. Then he glanced toward a group of senior officers speaking nearby. One of them happened to recognize me. The officer walked over immediately. Ma'am, he stood noticeably straighter. Others followed. Respectful greetings, professional courtesy. Nothing unusual, at least not from my perspective, but I noticed something. Ethan's expression, confusion, just for a second. A tiny crack in his assumptions, as though he suddenly realized there might be things about me he didn't understand. Then the moment passed and he walked away. The investigation continued. More interviews, more records, more findings. Gradually, the concerns became harder to dismiss. Several junior officers described a command climate built around fear rather than respect. Not abuse, not harassment, fear. People worried about disagreeing with him, worried about challenging decisions, worried about becoming targets. That bothered me deeply. The Navy needs strong leaders, but strength without humility eventually becomes weakness. Every time, history proves it. Then came the interview that changed everything. A senior investigator called late on a Thursday afternoon. His voice sounded different immediately, more serious, more cautious. We received additional testimony. I sat down my pen. What kind of testimony? A witness came forward voluntarily. My stomach tightened. Regarding what? There was a brief pause, then he answered, potential retaliation against a subordinate who reported concerns. I closed my eyes because retaliation changes everything. A leadership mistake can be corrected. Poor judgment can be addressed, but retaliation strikes at the heart of accountability itself, and if the allegation could be proven, the consequences would be severe, very severe. The investigator continued speaking, explaining Clear's throat details, explaining evidence, explaining next steps. But honestly, I barely heard him. My mind had already moved ahead toward possibilities, toward outcomes, toward the realization that Ethan's future suddenly looked far less certain than it had a week earlier. When the call ended, I sat alone in the fading evening light. The office was quiet. Washington traffic hummed faintly outside, and for the first time since opening his file, I felt genuine fear. Not for myself, for him. Because a witness had just provided information that could end Ethan Collins's career forever. The allegation of retaliation changed the entire tone of the investigation. Up until that point, there had been room for optimism. Leadership deficiencies can be corrected. Poor judgment can be coached. Even repeated mistakes can sometimes become valuable lessons. But retaliation is different. Retaliation sends a message to everyone watching. It tells subordinates that honesty comes with consequences. It teaches people to stay silent. And silence is dangerous in any organization, especially the military. For nearly 36 years, I had watched institutions succeed or fail based on one simple principle, whether people felt safe telling the truth. Now the question was whether Ethan had crossed that line. The following week was consumed by interviews, witness statements, legal reviews, additional documentation. The process moved carefully. Nobody wanted assumptions. Nobody wanted shortcuts. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. The truth mattered as it should. One of the witnesses was a lieutenant who had served under Ethan 18 months earlier. According to records, the officer had raised concerns about several questionable decisions. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic. Simply concerns. Shortly afterward, the lieutenant's responsibilities had been reduced. Assignments changed. Opportunities disappeared. The timing was difficult to ignore. The investigator handling the interview summarized the findings during a briefing. When he finished, nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Everyone understood the significance. The evidence wasn't definitive yet, but it was concerning, very concerning. I remained quiet throughout the discussion, listening, taking notes, doing exactly what my position required. Nothing more, nothing less. That evening, Richard called. The moment I heard his voice, guilt settled in my stomach, not because I had done anything wrong, because I was carrying knowledge I couldn't share. How was your day? He asked. Busy. Everything okay? Just work. He laughed softly. That's your answer for everything. Maybe it was. For decades, I'd learned how to separate professional responsibilities from personal relationships. Most of the time, that skill served me well. This time, it felt like carrying a secret too heavy to hold. Richard talked about a fishing trip he was planning, a neighbor who had purchased a new boat, normal things, ordinary things, the kind of conversations married couples have every day. And through the entire call, I kept thinking about Ethan, about what might happen next, about how much pain was approaching this family, whether any of us were ready for it. I wasn't sure. 2 weeks later, the investigation reached a critical point. A review board convened. Additional findings were presented. More testimony was analyzed. By then, the pattern had become difficult to dismiss. No single incident would have ended Ethan's career. That wasn't the issue. The issue was accumulation. 100 small decisions. 100 moments when humility should have prevailed. 100 opportunities to listen that had been ignored. Leadership failures rarely arrive all at once. They grow slowly like cracks in a foundation, invisible until one day they aren't. The board reached a preliminary conclusion. Formal administrative action was warranted. Promotion consideration would be suspended pending final review. Corrective measures would likely follow. The recommendation moved forward. And for the first time, Ethan's future became uncertain. 3 days later, everything exploded, not publicly, not in the media, inside Navy channels. Word had reached Ethan, not the details, just enough information to tell him that serious questions had emerged. I wasn't present when he learned, but according to several accounts, he reacted exactly as many successful people do when confronted by unexpected scrutiny. At first, disbelief, then anger, then determination. He requested clarification, requested documentation, requested meetings, nothing unusual. Every officer has rights. Every officer deserves due process. The system exists for that reason, yet as the process unfolded, another truth emerged. Ethan had never imagined he could be the subject of an investigation, not really. For years, success had insulated him from self-doubt. Now that insulation was disappearing. A few days later, I was reviewing reports when my assistant entered. You have a visitor, I looked up. Who? She hesitated. The hesitation told me everything. Ethan Collins. For a moment neither of us spoke. I checked my watch. No appointment, no scheduled meeting, just Ethan standing outside my office. I understood immediately. The investigation had reached him and now he wanted answers. Unfortunately, answers weren't something I could provide. Send him in. My assistant nodded. A few seconds later the door opened. Ethan entered. The confidence I was accustomed to seeing was still present, but something else had joined it. Concern, real concern. He closed the door behind him. Margaret, Ethan. For several seconds neither of us moved, neither of us smiled. Finally he spoke. I have a question. I gestured toward a chair. You can ask. He sat down slowly then leaned forward. I heard something today. I said nothing. He continued. Someone mentioned your office. Still nothing. Then came the question. What exactly do you do for the Navy? I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because after 3 years he was finally asking. 3 years, countless family dinners, countless assumptions, countless opportunities, and only now had curiosity appeared. I chose my words carefully. My position isn't relevant to your situation. It is to me. His voice carried frustration and confusion. The confusion interested me most because it suggested the foundation beneath his assumptions was beginning to crack. Ethan, what? You should focus on your responsibilities. He stared at me clearly unsatisfied, then he stood. Without another word he left. What? The answer arrived the following week, not from me, from the Navy. As part of routine administrative procedures, Ethan reviewed documentation connected to the oversight process. Within those materials were organizational references, reporting chains, office authorities, titles, names, facts, the kind of facts that don't care what someone believes. Few hours later Richard called. His voice sounded stunned, not upset, stunned. He knows. I closed my eyes. The moment had finally arrived. What happened? Ethan came to the house. I remained silent. Richard continued. He thought there was a mistake. He couldn't believe it. I understood perfectly. For 3 years Ethan had built an image of me, a wealthy widow hunter, a comfortable retiree, a woman living off his father's success. Now that image had collided with reality and reality had won. Richard sighed heavily. He kept asking the same question. What question? Why didn't anyone tell me? I looked out the window toward the Washington skyline. The answer seemed obvious because nobody had hidden it. Not really. He had simply never cared enough to ask. The final review concluded 2 weeks later. The findings were clear. No criminal conduct, no corruption, no fraud, but significant failures of leadership, documented, verified, undeniable. His promotion was suspended. Administrative consequences followed. His reputation took a serious hit. And for the first time in his adult life, Ethan Collins discovered that talent alone could not protect him from accountability. A week later, a request appeared in my inbox, not through official channels, not through lawyers, not through the Navy, a personal request, simple, direct, unexpected. Commander Ethan Collins was asking for a private meeting, not with the Inspector General, with his stepmother. And somehow that frightened me more than the investigation ever had. I spent most of my career preparing for difficult conversations. I had informed families of casualties, delivered career-ending decisions, conducted investigations that changed lives, faced members of Congress, briefed senior military leaders. None of those experiences prepared me for meeting Ethan that afternoon because this wasn't an official meeting. There were no regulations to guide it, no procedures, no checklists, no rank, just 2 people carrying years of misunderstanding into the same room. He asked to meet at my home rather than my office. I appreciated that. Whatever happened next belonged to family, not the Navy. Richard was away visiting an old friend in North Carolina, which left the house quiet. The Chesapeake Bay shimmered beyond the back deck. A warm breeze moved through the trees. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that usually made me feel grateful. Instead, I felt nervous, genuinely nervous. As strange as that sounds, I had no idea which version of Ethan would walk through the door, the angry one, the defensive one, or perhaps the arrogant one who had mocked me for years. At exactly 2:00, the doorbell rang, military punctuality. Some habits never disappear. I opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The previous few weeks had clearly taken a toll. There were dark circles beneath his eyes. The confidence was still there, but it no longer filled the room. Humility had finally made space beside it. Hi, Margaret. Hi, Ethan. I stepped aside. Come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Richard and I shared breakfast every morning, the same table where family conversations had happened countless times. Only now the atmosphere felt completely different. Poured coffee, he thanked me. Small talk lasted less than a minute, then silence settled between us. Finally, Ethan spoke. I owe you an apology. I waited. He looked down at his coffee cup. For several seconds he seemed unable to continue, then the words finally came. I've treated you badly. Simple, direct, honest, more honest than anything I'd heard from him in 3 years. I remained quiet, not because I wanted him to suffer, because some truths need room to breathe. He took a deep breath. I convinced myself you married Dad for money. I nodded slightly. I know, and I told other people. I know that too. His face tightened, embarrassment, regret, shame. The emotions were impossible to miss. What makes it worse, he said, is that I never had any evidence. I didn't answer because he was right. He never had, not once. Everything had been assumption. Everything had been imagination. Everything had been a story he'd written in his own mind. For a while, neither of us spoke. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked quietly. A boat passed somewhere beyond the shoreline. Life continued as it always does. Eventually, Ethan looked up. Can I ask you something? Of course, why didn't you tell me? There it was again, the same question Richard had mentioned, the same question Ethan kept asking everyone. I leaned back in my chair. What exactly should I have told you? Who you were? I smiled faintly. I never hid who I was. His eyebrows furrowed. You know what I mean. Actually, I don't. The confusion on his face deepened, so I continued. You never asked about my career. Silence. You never asked where I served. More silence. You never asked what I did for 35 years. His eyes dropped. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was simply stating facts. Facts have a way of hurting all by themselves. Finally, he nodded. You're right. It was probably the first time I'd ever heard him say those words to me. The conversation shifted, slowly, carefully, like two people crossing a frozen lake, testing each step before committing their weight. For the first time, Ethan asked genuine questions, not sarcastic questions, not loaded questions, real ones. Where had I grown up? How had I joined the Navy? What had my career been like? So I told him, not everything, just enough. I told him about growing up in rural Ohio, a small town where opportunities were limited, a place where nobody expected girls to become admirals. I told him about joining the Navy at 18, about sleeping in crowded barracks, about learning discipline, responsibility, sacrifice. I told him about deployments, years away from family, Christmases missed, birthdays forgotten, friends buried, dreams postponed, the price of service, the price most Americans never see. Ethan listened quietly. For once, he wasn't waiting for his turn to speak. He was listening, really listening, and I could see something happening. The image he had carried for years was falling apart piece by piece. Eventually, he asked the question I knew was coming. Were you angry? I considered that carefully. Sometimes. Why didn't you say anything? I laughed softly because arguing wouldn't have changed your mind. That answer seemed to surprise him. It wouldn't have. No, I shook my head. You weren't looking for information, Ethan. He stared at me. You were looking for confirmation. His expression told me he understood exactly what I meant. People often do that. They decide what they believe, then spend years collecting evidence that supports it. Everything else gets ignored. That's what Ethan had done. Not because he was evil, because he was human. The conversation continued for more than 2 hours. Eventually, we reached a subject neither of us had mentioned directly, his mother, Susan, the woman whose absence still shaped this family, even after all these years. Ethan stared out the window. I think I hated you before I even met you. The honesty startled me, but I appreciated it. Why? His answer came immediately, because you weren't her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. When Dad started dating again, I felt guilty. Guilty, he nodded, like moving on meant forgetting her. Suddenly, everything made sense. The hostility, the assumptions, the resentment, it had never really been about money. Money had simply been the excuse. The real wound was grief, unresolved grief. The kind that quietly follows people for years. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. The gesture surprised both of us. Your mother would want you to be happy. His eyes filled with tears instantly. The reaction was so sudden it caught him off guard. He looked away, embarrassed. But at 31 years old, he was finally allowing himself to feel something he'd spent years avoiding. Loss. The sun was beginning to set when Ethan finally stood. The conversation had changed something, not everything. Healing never works that quickly, but something. At the door he hesitated, then turned toward me. I have one last question. I waited. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, more vulnerable, more honest. Do you think I deserve a second chance? The question lingered in the evening air, and in that moment I realized he wasn't asking about the Navy. He was asking about his life, about his future, about whether mistakes had permanently defined him, and my answer would matter more than either of us realized. For a long moment I simply looked at him. The question hung between us. Do you think I deserve a second chance? At 58 years old, I'd learned something important about second chances. Most people ask for them when what they really want is forgiveness. But forgiveness and second chances aren't the same thing. Forgiveness is something another person gives you. A second chance is something you earn. Ethan, I said carefully, I think everyone deserves a second chance. Relief flickered across his face. Then I continued, but not everyone is willing to do the work required to earn one. The relief disappeared, not because I had been harsh, because he understood exactly what I meant. The investigation had consequences. Those consequences weren't disappearing. His promotion remained suspended. The administrative findings remained in his record. His reputation had taken a significant hit. None of that could be erased, nor should it be. Actions matter, accountability matters, integrity matters, especially in leadership. He nodded slowly. I understand. For the first time, I believed he truly did. After he left, I sat alone on the back deck and watched the sunset. The sky over the Chesapeake turned orange and gold. The water reflected the fading light. Everything felt strangely peaceful, not because the situation was resolved, because the truth was finally out. There is a certain freedom that comes with truth, even painful truth. The pretending stops, the guessing stops. The stories we invent about each other finally lose their power. For 3 years, Ethan had been fighting a version of me that never existed. Now he was finally meeting the real person. And perhaps for the first time I was meeting the real Ethan too. Not the arrogant officer, not the resentful stepson, just a flawed man trying to find his way like the rest of us. The months that followed weren't easy. Growth rarely is. The Navy required Ethan to complete additional leadership development programs. His command responsibilities were adjusted. Several senior officers monitored his progress. Some people expected him to resign. Others assumed his career was finished. Neither had. Instead, something unexpected occurred. He got better, not immediately, not dramatically. Gradually, one day at a time, the officers who worked with him began noticing changes. He listened more, interrupted less, accepted criticism without becoming defensive, sought feedback instead of avoiding it. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in the perspectives of others. One commander who had known Ethan for years called me privately. He seems different. I smiled. Different how? Humbler. There was a pause. Honestly, he's becoming a better leader. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat quietly for several minutes feeling something I hadn't expected. Pride, not because Ethan had succeeded, because he had chosen to change. Those are very different things. Richard noticed it too. The transformation became impossible to miss. Family gatherings felt lighter, conversations felt easier. The tension that had dominated every holiday slowly faded. One afternoon, Richard and I were walking along the beach near our home. Clear as throat, the wind carried the smell of salt water. Seagulls drifted overhead. The kind of ordinary afternoon that often becomes precious later. Richard slipped his hand into mine. You know, he said, I almost lost hope. About what? You and Ethan. I laughed softly. There were moments when I did too. He smiled, but somehow you got through it. I looked toward the water. No, what do you mean? Ethan got through it. That distinction mattered. Nobody can force another person to grow. They have to choose it themselves. Nearly 8 months after our conversation, Richard hosted a family barbecue. Nothing fancy, just burgers, hot dogs, potato salad. The kinds of meals American families have been sharing for generations. Children ran across the yard, neighbors stopped by, people laughed, talked, enjoyed the summer weather. At one point I was helping carry food to the picnic table when I heard Ethan speaking with several relatives. Normally I wouldn't have paid attention. Then I heard my name. I paused, not intentionally, just long enough to hear what came next. One of the relatives asked how I knew so much about military leadership. A fair question, especially from someone who didn't know my background. Before I could answer, Ethan did. He stood there holding a paper plate, completely relaxed, completely sincere. My stepmother spent decades serving this country. The conversation around him quieted. He continued, she's one of the finest officers I've ever known. For a moment, nobody spoke. Neither did I, because the significance wasn't in the compliment, it was in the ownership. My stepmother, not Dad's wife, not Margaret, not the gold digger. My stepmother family. The simple word meant more than he probably realized. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home, the four of us sat outside. Richard, Ethan, Ethan's wife Lauren, and me. The sun had disappeared. The porch lights glowed softly against the darkness. The conversation drifted naturally from one topic to another. Family stories, travel plans, old memories, future hopes. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just family, and somehow that felt extraordinary. At one point, Ethan looked toward me. I owe you more than an apology. I shook my head. No, yes, I do. I smiled. You don't owe me anything. He frowned. After everything I said, I nodded because this was never about me. The confusion returned briefly, then understanding followed. The lesson had finally landed. The real battle had never been between Ethan and me. It had been between Ethan and the assumptions he carried, the stories he told himself, the judgments he made before knowing the truth. Once those disappeared, everything else became possible. As I look back now, I realize this was never really a story about revenge. At least not the kind most people imagine. Nobody got destroyed, nobody got humiliated, nobody lost everything. The greatest victory wasn't watching Ethan face consequences, it was watching him become better because of them. That's a far more meaningful outcome for him, for Richard, for our family, and honestly for me, because life has taught me something that took decades to understand. The people who hurt us are often carrying wounds we cannot see. That doesn't excuse their behavior, but understanding those wounds can sometimes accomplish what anger never will. So if you've stayed with me through this story, perhaps there's someone in your own life you've misunderstood, or someone who has misunderstood you. Maybe the lesson isn't about proving who's right. Maybe it's about asking one more question before making one more judgment. You might be surprised by what you learn. And if this story touched you in some way, I'd love for you to share your thoughts and experiences. Stories like these remind us that growth, forgiveness, and family can still matter at any age. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about life, resilience, and second chances, I hope you'll join me again.